The second piece of what you're looking at today is now that we know how to actually list out or identify the factors of an expression, how can we use those to technically factor that expression out? And so we need to be able to find the GCF between two or more terms. And we're going to focus today just on finding the GCF between two terms. So how do we do this? So first off is think about how we factored out our numbers before. So I showed you two different ways that you could do this. You could either do a factor tree, in which case you want to consider all of the factors that are the ends of the factor tree. And you would then compare your two factor trees and compare just the pieces at the end that match up. And you could multiply those together to find your GCF. I actually find it more helpful to use that factor table that I showed you with our factors of 24 when I'm considering factors for GCF and the factoring that you're going to do in the next couple lessons. So let's actually do a table of factors for our numbers, and then we can consider the GCF of the variables next. So we have two number parts of our terms. We have a 32 and we have an 18. So for each one, we want to consider what are all the possible factors. So let's just run through, and I'm just going to start at 1 and what happens when I divide that out of that expression. So 32, well, I know that's 1 times 32. I can always do 1 and factor out a 1 from that term, no matter what it is. What about 2? Well, 2 is a factor of 32. And what happens when you divide 32 by 2? You get 16. Okay. So 3, well, if you check that on your calculator, 32 divided by 3 gives us a decimal. So we don't want to consider that one. What about 4? Well, 4 times 8 gives us 32. Okay, if you check it on your calculator, 32 divided by 6, unfortunately, does not divide out. And then we're getting up to 8. And then we'd have things like 10, which doesn't factor out, and 12 doesn't factor out. So these are all of our factors to consider for 32. We can consider 1, 2, 4, 8, and 32. 18, smaller value, so a little easier to list them all out. Again, we could use 1 times 18. We could use 2 times 9. We could use 3 times 6. And again, beyond that, there aren't any other numbers that divide into 18 evenly. And so looking at my list of all my possible factors, what's the biggest number that's in common between both lists? So unfortunately, we don't have a very big GCF on this one. That's okay. So we have a 2 as a common number for our factors. Okay, so now we need to consider our variables. So kind of like before, if we want to consider all of our possible variables, the easiest way to do this is look for which variables are listed in both terms. And then all you're going to do is write out the one that has the lowest possible exponent on it. So looking at our terms, again, you don't want to forget, well, what's the exponent of just a plain old variable that's sitting there? Well, in 32 x squared y, technically how many y's are multiplied in? Well, just 1. So I'm going to put an implied exponent of 1. And for the 18 x cubed y squared, both of those already have exponents on them. So we're actually ready to write out our GCF. So our common factor between our two lists was 2. So that goes into our GCF. Between our x terms, x squared and x cubed, which one has the smaller exponent? Well, that's x squared. And then between y and y squared, which of those has the smaller exponent? Well, the plain y. And so your GCF between 32 x squared y and 18 x cubed y squared is 2x squared y. Okay, now you've got several examples to look at on Desmos, but let's go ahead and start the first one together. So the first example you're going to check out is example 6. What's your GCF? What's your greatest common factor between 25x squared and 15x? So I'm going to leave the variable piece of this to figure out on your own, but let's look at the numbers to get you started. So again, let's make 2 factoring lists. So 1 for 25 and 1 for 15. So for 25, I know I could do 1 times 25. What's the only other factor that you know of for 25? Well, that's just 5. 5 times 5 to get 25. What about 15? So 15 is either 1 times 15 is one combination. What other factors do you know? I could factor out a 3 on this one, but those are my only factors. So now pick out what you feel is the largest value. That's your number. That's your GCF for your number part. So then you need to pick out what's your GCF for between x squared and x. Now, the problems that you're going to be working on next, you have a few multiple choice problems that are all self-checking, so they'll tell you whether you get those correct or not. And then you're going to have a card sort, again, self-checking, kind of like what you've done before, where you're going to match up what's your pair of factors or pair of terms, and you need to match it up with the card that has the one term on it. That's the common GCF. Again, if you get stuck on anything, hit ask for help button and I will pop in.